I still remember the sound of the door before I remember the words. Not the slam, it wasn't dramatic like that. It was the quiet, ordinary sound of a door opening when it shouldn't have. The kind of sound that doesn't feel dangerous until it suddenly is. I was sitting close to him, too close to pretend we weren't together, laughing at something small and unimportant. I didn't even have time to move before I felt the air change. My mother stood there. She didn't shout. That's what made it worse. Her face didn't show anger right away. It showed shock, disappointment, something deeper that felt heavier than yelling ever could. In that second, I knew this wasn't just about a boy. It was about trust, about rules I didn't even realize I had crossed so completely. He stood up immediately, polite, nervous, trying to explain himself without knowing what to say. I stayed seated, frozen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was pressing against my ribs. I couldn't meet her eyes. I already knew what I would see there. That evening stretched longer than any night I can remember. Conversations happened, without really happening. Words were said, but none of them landed softly. My father didn't speak much, which somehow made everything heavier. Silence filled the house in a way I never felt before. When my mother finally spoke to me alone, her voice was calm, controlled, and that frightened me more than anger. She asked questions I didn't know how to answer, without sounding like I was defending something I wasn't even sure how to explain. "He's just my friend," I said at one point. She looked at me for a long moment. "Then why did you hide it?" I didn't have an answer that felt honest enough. That was the beginning of the hardest period of my life. The next morning, everything had changed. My phone felt heavier in my hand. The house felt smaller. My parents sat me down and explained their decision, not as a punishment, they said, but as protection. I wasn't allowed to meet friends freely anymore. No hanging out. No trips. No casual visits. School and home. That was it. 2 years. At the time, I couldn't even imagine 2 weeks. The first few months were unbearable. Every message from friends felt like a reminder of what I had lost. Invitations stopped coming gradually, not out of cruelty, but because life moves on when you're not part of it. I watched friendships fade through a screen, through stories I couldn't join, laughter I couldn't hear in real time. I was angry, not just at my parents, at myself. I replayed that moment over and over in my head, wondering why I hadn't been more careful, why I hadn't thought ahead. I blamed my innocence. I blamed my trust. Sometimes I blamed love itself. At night, I lay awake listening to the house breathe, feeling trapped inside a version of myself I didn't recognize anymore. I felt older and smaller at the same time. I wanted to explain to my parents that I hadn't done anything wrong in my heart, but I didn't yet have the language for that. The boy disappeared quietly from my life. Not because of drama, not because of anger, but because there was no space left for him. A few messages turned into none. Time did what it always does when you don't fight it. And that hurt more than I expected. What surprised me was how lonely discipline can feel when it's wrapped in love. My parents didn't shout. They didn't insult me. They watched me closely, asked questions, tried to guide me. And still I felt misunderstood. I stopped asking to go out because I already knew the answer. I stopped dressing up for no reason. I stopped checking my phone as often. Slowly, without noticing, my world turned inward. But something else happened during those 2 years. I started noticing myself. Without distractions, without friends pulling me in different directions, I had nothing to do but sit with my own thoughts. At first, that was unbearable. Then it became familiar. Then, unexpectedly, it became grounding. I started reading more, writing things I never planned to show anyone, thinking deeply about what I wanted, not just what felt exciting in the moment. I questioned my choices, my boundaries, my understanding of love and attention. I realized something painful and freeing at the same time. I hadn't been wrong to feel what I felt, but I had been unprepared for the consequences of acting without awareness. That understanding didn't come quickly. It took months of resentment, tears, quiet dinners, and long silences. It took watching my parents worry about me in ways I hadn't noticed before. It took realizing that their fear didn't come from control alone. It came from love shaped by their own experiences. I didn't forgive them immediately. I didn't suddenly agree with everything they did. But slowly, the anger softened into understanding. By the end of the first year, I wasn't counting days anymore. By the end of the second, I wasn't the same girl who had frozen in that chair when the door opened. I had learned restraint. Not forced restraint, conscious restraint. I had learned how quickly moments can change lives. How trust is fragile. How freedom feels different when you've lost it once. When my parents finally began to loosen their rules again, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't desperate anymore. I didn't rush back into everything I'd missed. I moved carefully, intentionally. I chose differently, not because I was afraid, but because I understood myself better. That difficult time didn't break me. It reshaped me. And even now, when I think back to that moment, the door, the silence, the look on my mother's face, I don't feel only shame or regret. I feel gratitude for the lesson that arrived wrapped in pain. Because sometimes the hardest seasons are the ones that quietly teach you who you are becoming. The second year felt different from the first, not because the rules changed, but because I did. I stopped waking up angry. That surprised me at first. Anger had become familiar, almost comforting, like proof that I still cared. When it faded, it left behind something quieter, reflection. I started seeing patterns in myself that I'd never noticed before. How quickly I trusted. How deeply I attached. How easily I confused attention with security. I began to understand why that moment had frightened my parents so much. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they imagined could happen if I kept moving through life without breaks. My mother started talking to me more during that time. Not interrogations. Conversations. While folding laundry. While cooking. While sitting beside me on the couch in the evenings. She told me things she'd never told me before. About her own youth, her own mistakes, the way one decision can quietly shape years of your life.
I listened differently then.
I didn't always agree with her, but I finally heard her fear beneath the rules. And I think she began to see my maturity beneath my silence. I was still restricted, still not free. But the house didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a pause, an uncomfortable one, but not meaningless. I noticed how my confidence shifted inward. I wasn't performing for friends anymore. I wasn't shaping myself to be liked. I learned how to sit alone without feeling empty. That skill would save me later in ways I couldn't imagine yet. There were moments, of course, when loneliness hit hard. Birthdays I didn't celebrate the way I used to. Messages I read but didn't reply to because I didn't know how to explain my absence anymore. Those moments hurt. Quietly, deeply. But they also clarified something important. Not everyone who leaves your life is taken from you. Some people simply drift away when your pace changes. When the restrictions finally eased near the end of that second year, my parents expected excitement, relief, maybe rebellion. Instead, I surprised them and myself by moving slowly. I asked before going out. I came home on time. I chose carefully who I spent time with. Not because I was afraid of being caught again, but because I understood what I was risking. The girl who once thought love was something you hide had learned that honesty, even when uncomfortable, is safer than secrecy. I promised myself then that I would never again place myself in a moment I couldn't stand behind openly. That promise became my compass. I didn't resent my parents anymore. I didn't romanticize that boy either. Both belonged to a past that had already taught me what it needed to. What stayed with me was the strength I didn't know I had, the kind that grows quietly when no one is watching, when life slows you down whether you want it to or not. And I carried that strength forward, unaware that it would soon be tested again. Not by rules, not by doors opening unexpectedly, but by choices I would have to make on my own. When freedom finally returned, it didn't feel the way I had imagined during those long, restricted months. I had pictured relief rushing in, excitement bursting through me the moment the rules softened. Instead, what I felt was caution, not fear, but awareness. Freedom now carried weight. It asked questions before it offered pleasure. My parents didn't announce the change formally. It happened gradually. A question asked instead of a command. a pause instead of an immediate no. The first time my mother said, "Just be home by evening," I nodded quietly, almost unsure how to hold that permission. I remember stepping outside that day and feeling strange in my own body. The street looked the same. The air felt the same. But I was different. I wasn't rushing toward anything. I was paying attention. Friends noticed it too. "You've changed," one of them said casually, like an observation rather than a judgment. I smiled but didn't explain. I didn't know how to put it into words yet. How do you explain that isolation taught you discipline without bitterness? That silence sharpened your intuition? That being watched made you learn how to watch yourself? I started choosing my time more carefully. I said no more often. I left early sometimes. I didn't need to be everywhere to feel included anymore. That was new and surprisingly empowering. The memory of that moment with my mother never left me. Not as fear, but as a reminder. A quiet checkpoint in my mind. Whenever I felt tempted to cross a line without thinking, I paused. Not because I was afraid of consequences, but because I respected myself more than the thrill of the moment. I also noticed something else. I didn't fall quickly anymore. Before, emotions had swept me up easily. A little attention, a little closeness, and I would attach meaning before understanding intention. Now I waited. I observed. I let people reveal themselves before offering too much of me. That didn't make me colder. It made me clearer. There were moments when I wondered if I had become too guarded. When attraction appeared, I questioned it gently instead of surrendering immediately. But over time, I realized it wasn't fear holding me back. It was discernment guiding me forward. My parents saw the change too, even if they didn't name it. Trust rebuilt slowly, not through promises, but through consistency. Through coming home when I said I would. Through honesty that wasn't forced. Through choices that aligned with my words. One evening, my father said something small that stayed with me. We were sitting quietly, the TV playing in the background. "You handle yourself differently now," he said. More thoughtfully. I nodded, surprised by the emotion that rose in my chest. That acknowledgement mattered more than any freedom I'd been waiting for. I didn't tell him how hard those 2 years had been. I didn't need to. He knew in his own way. And I knew too, not as a wound, but as a foundation. That experience changed how I approached everything that followed.
Love.
Friendship. Independence. I no longer rushed toward closeness just to feel chosen. I chose myself first, and then allowed others in. That didn't make life quieter. It made it steadier. And even now, when I think back to that girl sitting frozen in her chair, heart racing as the door opened, I don't see someone weak or careless. I see someone standing at the beginning of a lesson she didn't ask for, but one that would shape her far more deeply than she ever expected. After that conversation with my father, something inside me settled more firmly than before. It wasn't pride, and it wasn't relief. It was a quiet acceptance of the past, of the boundaries that had once felt suffocating, and of the person I was becoming because of them. Life didn't suddenly become easier. Trust doesn't rebuild itself overnight, and neither does confidence. There were still days when I felt watched, when a simple question like, "Where are you going?" made my chest tighten. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because memory has a way of lingering in the body longer than it does in the mind. I learned to respond calmly anyway, not defensively, not with impatience. Calm became my language. I noticed how that changed the atmosphere in the house. My parents relaxed without realizing they were doing it. Conversations flowed more naturally. Laughter returned in small, ordinary moments. We weren't repairing something broken anymore. We were building something new. Outside the house, I moved differently too. I didn't overshare my life with friends the way I once had. Not because I was hiding, but because I had learned that privacy can be powerful. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed how people behaved when they didn't think they were being evaluated. Some friendships deepened. Others faded quietly. I stopped chasing the ones that drifted. I understood now that connection doesn't survive on effort alone. It survives on alignment. That realization hurt less than I expected. It felt honest. There were moments when attraction surfaced again. Glances held a second too long. conversations that carried a charge beneath the words. But I approached those moments differently now. I didn't rush them. I didn't dramatize them. I let them exist without immediately asking what they meant. That patience surprised people. "You're hard to read now," someone once said, half smiling. I smiled back. "I read myself just fine." What I didn't say was that I had learned the cost of confusion. I had lived inside it for 2 years, stripped of distraction, forced to confront my own impulses. I wasn't afraid of feeling anymore. I was afraid of betraying myself. The memory of my mother standing in that doorway never disappeared, but it softened. It no longer replayed with shame attached. It replayed with clarity. A reminder that some moments divide your life quietly into before and after. Before, I had moved through emotion instinctively. After, I moved through it intentionally. That difference changed everything. My parents began trusting my judgment more than my obedience. They noticed how I handled disappointment, how I communicated when something felt unfair, how I didn't lash out when I didn't get my way. That growth didn't come from restriction alone. It came from reflection. One evening, my mother sat beside me while we watched something forgettable on television. Out of nowhere, she said, "You know, I worried I had hurt you too much." I swallowed, choosing my words carefully. "You hurt me," I said honestly. "But you also taught me something I didn't know I needed." She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. No apology. No explanation. Just acknowledgement. That was enough. I realized then that my parents weren't the villains I had once made them in my anger. They were flawed, frightened, loving people trying to protect their child without always knowing how. Understanding that didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context. As time passed, the restrictions faded almost completely. I went out. I traveled. I lived. But I carried that lesson with me like a quiet compass. Whenever a situation felt rushed or hidden, something inside me slowed me down. I had learned that secrecy creates pressure, and pressure distorts judgment. That knowledge shaped my future choices more than any rule ever could. And still, there were days when the past brushed against me unexpectedly. A tone of voice, a sudden silence, a door closing too quietly. Those moments reminded me how deeply that experience had etched itself into my nervous system. But instead of shrinking, I grounded myself. I breathed. I stayed present. I trusted who I had become. That's what those 2 years gave me. Not fear, not obedience, but self-awareness. The kind that stays with you long after the rules are gone. And as I stepped further into adulthood, carrying that awareness with me, I didn't yet realize how often it would protect me from repeating old mistakes, or how it would eventually help me recognize something real when it finally appeared again. There was a moment, sometime after all of that had settled, when I realized I no longer felt the need to explain myself to anyone, not my parents, not my friends, not even to myself. That urge to justify every choice had faded quietly, replaced by something steadier. Confidence. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that shows up in how you pause before responding, in how you say no without apology, in how you don't rush to fill empty space. I noticed it first in small situations. Someone would push a little too hard for my attention, and instead of feeling flattered or pressured, I would simply step back. Not coldly.
Calmly.
I didn't need to make a point. My boundaries spoke for me. That was new. Before everything happened, I thought boundaries were walls, harsh, limiting, unfriendly. Now I understood they were more like doors. You decide when to open them, who to invite in, and when to close them again without guilt. My parents trusted me almost fully by then. Not because I followed every rule perfectly, but because I was honest. If I was unsure about something, I said so. If I wanted more freedom, I asked for it directly. We still disagreed sometimes, but the fear that once lived between us had softened into something like mutual respect. I think they saw that I wasn't running from them anymore. And I wasn't running from myself either. There were times when memories of that boy surfaced, not as longing, not as regret, just as part of my story. He had been a chapter, not a destination. I didn't need to rewrite it. I didn't need to romanticize it. I let it stay where it belonged. That acceptance freed up space inside me. I started noticing how many people confuse secrecy with excitement. How hiding feels thrilling at first, until it becomes heavy. I had lived inside that heaviness long enough to recognize it instantly. Whenever something required me to lie, to conceal, to pretend, my body resisted. That resistance was wisdom. I also became gentler with younger people around me. Friends who rushed into things, who acted on impulse, who hadn't yet learned the cost of certain choices. I didn't judge them. I saw myself in them. And sometimes when they asked, I spoke honestly, not to scare them, but to ground them. You don't have to hide to feel alive, I would say. And if something can't exist in the light, ask yourself why. Those words weren't something I had learned from books. They were earned. Looking back now, I don't wish those 2 years away. I wouldn't choose them again, but I wouldn't erase them either. They slowed me down at a time when I might have sped into something that wasn't ready for me. They taught me that love without honesty is fragile. That freedom without awareness is temporary. That growth often arrives disguised as restriction. And most importantly, they taught me how to sit with discomfort without letting it define me. I became someone who could wait. Someone who could listen. Someone who could choose with clarity instead of urgency. That door opening all those years ago didn't ruin my life. It redirected it. And the girl who once froze in that moment learned something invaluable in the years that followed. That strength isn't built when everything goes your way. It's built when life stops you long enough to ask who you really are. Time did what it always does. It kept moving, whether I was ready or not. Classes ended, semesters changed, people came and went. On the surface, my life looked ordinary again. But underneath that normal rhythm, I carried a deeper awareness that never really switched off. I started noticing how often people lived in reaction. Reacting to attraction. Reacting to loneliness. Reacting to fear of missing out. I had lived that way once too, before everything stopped me in my tracks. Now, I moved differently. I responded instead of reacting. That difference showed up most clearly when someone new entered my life. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't demand attention. He noticed me quietly, respectfully. We met through friends, in a setting where nothing was hidden and nothing needed to be. At first, we talked casually, the way people do when there's no agenda attached. I felt no rush, no internal pressure to define what was happening. That alone told me I had changed. As we spent more time around each other, I paid attention to how my body responded. Not butterflies, not anxiety, calm curiosity. I didn't lose sleep replaying conversations. I didn't censor myself to seem interesting. I showed up as I was, trusting that whoever stayed would be someone who could meet me there. I thought about my parents more during that time, especially my mother. I understood now how terrifying it must have been for her to see me standing at the edge of something she couldn't control. Fear doesn't always look like love, but it often grows from it. One evening, we talked openly about that period for the first time in years. Not emotionally charged. Not defensive. I didn't understand you then, I told her. But I understand myself now because of it. She nodded slowly, eyes soft. I wish I had known how to protect you without hurting you. That sentence stayed with me. It reminded me that everyone is learning, even when they're in the role of authority. Especially then. As I grew older, that lesson shaped how I treated people who trusted me with their vulnerability. I didn't shame them for mistakes. I didn't rush to control them. I offered honesty and space, the things I had needed most when I was younger. There were still moments when old instincts surfaced. When secrecy felt tempting. When rebellion whispered that hiding was easier than explaining. But I didn't follow that voice anymore. I had learned what hiding costs. I chose transparency, even when it was uncomfortable. That didn't make my life simpler, but it made it cleaner. Clearer. I knew where I stood. Others knew where they stood with me. There was no double life, no split between who I was at home and who I was outside. That integration mattered more than I realized. Sometimes, late at night, I thought back to that exact moment. The door opening, the silence, the weight of being seen before I was ready. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a marker. A line between innocence and awareness. I didn't rush past it anymore. I honored it. Because without that moment, I might never have learned how powerful it is to choose honesty before excitement, clarity before impulse, self-respect before validation. That experience didn't take my freedom away. It taught me how to carry it. And as I continued stepping forward into adulthood, making choices, forming connections, building a life that felt aligned, I knew something with certainty. I would never again give my power to a moment that required me to disappear from myself. That promise wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived quietly inside me, steady and unbreakable, guiding me forward, one deliberate, honest step at a time. As more time passed, I noticed how that experience had quietly rewired the way I handled conflict. Before, confrontation used to scare me. I avoided it, softened my words too much, agreed when I wasn't fully comfortable. Now, I didn't avoid it, but I didn't seek it either. I learned how to speak without escalating, how to stand my ground without hardening my heart. That balance took time. I practiced it in small ways. Telling a friend I couldn't meet when I was overwhelmed. Saying no without adding a long explanation. Admitting when something didn't sit right with me instead of pretending it didn't matter. Each time I did, I felt more anchored in myself. I realized something important during that phase. Discipline had taught me structure, but reflection taught me discernment. One without the other would have left me either rigid or reckless. Together, they made me intentional. I also became more aware of how quickly people label moments as mistakes. I didn't see that period of my life as a mistake anymore. I saw it as a misalignment between who I was and how prepared I was to handle what I felt. Misalignments don't deserve punishment. They deserve understanding. That perspective softened my view of myself. I stopped replaying the past with regret and started revisiting it with curiosity. Why did I react the way I did? What was I seeking in that relationship? What did I believe love was supposed to feel like back then? Those questions led me to deeper truths about my emotional needs and vulnerabilities. One of the hardest truths was realizing how much I wanted to feel chosen. Not loved, chosen. That desire made me quiet when I should have spoken, flexible when I should have been firm. Understanding that didn't shame me. It empowered me. Once you know what drives you, you can choose differently. I also noticed how that 2-year period sharpened my empathy. When friends came to me with stories of conflict at home, of being misunderstood, of feeling controlled, I didn't rush to give advice. I listened. I knew how isolating it feels to be restricted for your own good, without being fully heard. Sometimes I would say, this part won't last forever, but it will change you. And I meant it not as a warning but as reassurance. There were moments when my parents and I disagreed again later in life. Boundaries are not a one-time lesson, but those disagreements never felt explosive. We had learned how to recover from tension. That skill alone reshaped our relationship. I stopped seeing them as obstacles to my independence and started seeing them as witnesses to my growth. That shift didn't make me dependent, it made me grounded. And slowly, almost without noticing, I stepped into a version of myself that didn't need rebellion to feel free. I didn't need secrecy to feel alive. I didn't need conflict to prove I existed. I was free because I was aligned. That alignment showed up in the choices I made next, where I went, who I trusted, what I tolerated. I walked away sooner from things that felt off. I stayed longer in spaces that felt honest. I stopped negotiating my boundaries for temporary comfort. I also learned how to forgive myself fully. Not partially. Not conditionally. Fully. That forgiveness was the final piece I hadn't realized I was missing. Without it, growth feels like survival. With it, growth feels like expansion. And as I continued forward, building a life shaped by awareness rather than reaction, I carried that lesson quietly with me. Not as a scar, not as a warning, but as a foundation. The past no longer followed me like a shadow. It walked beside me like a teacher. And I kept going. There was a moment, much later, when I realized I had stopped telling that story to myself as something painful. It had become something instructive instead. The sharp edges had worn down, not because I forgot them, but because I understood them. I noticed it one afternoon while sitting alone doing nothing important. No music playing. No phone in my hand. Just quiet. That kind of quiet used to make me restless. Now it felt familiar, even comforting. I thought about how, during those 2 years, silence had been forced on me, and how, over time, I had learned to meet it instead of running from it. That changed how I handled discomfort in general. When something felt tense, I didn't immediately try to escape it. I stayed. I listened. I asked myself what the tension was trying to tell me. Most of the time, it wasn't warning me about danger. It was asking for honesty. That habit reshaped my relationships. I became someone people felt safe talking to, even when the truth was awkward or messy. I didn't rush to judge. I didn't rush to fix. I understood how fragile it feels to be seen before you're ready. I had lived that moment myself. Sometimes friends would confide in me about hiding parts of their lives from their families. I didn't encourage secrecy, but I didn't shame them either. I asked questions gently. I reminded them that hiding takes energy, and that energy comes from somewhere. I knew that cost well. I also noticed how my body reacted differently to attraction now. It wasn't a rush. It wasn't a loss of control. It was a quiet interest paired with awareness. I checked in with myself more often. I asked whether something felt aligned with who I was becoming, not just who I wanted to be in the moment. That internal check saved me from repeating old patterns. There were opportunities to do things the old way again, to sneak, to hide, to justify. Each time, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, followed by clarity. I didn't want to live split anymore. I didn't want a public version of myself and a private one that lived in shadows. Integrity became important to me in a way it hadn't been before. Not perfection. Integrity. I didn't need my parents' approval anymore, but I valued my own. That was the shift. When you reach that place, choices become simpler, not easier, but clearer. I think my parents sensed it too. Over time, their questions became curiosity instead of suspicion. Their concerns softened into interest. We didn't talk about the past often, but when we did, it no longer felt like unfinished business. It felt resolved. One evening, my mother said something quietly while we were cleaning up after dinner. "You grew up faster than I expected." I smiled, not bitter, not proud, just honest. I had to. She nodded, understanding more than she said. That acknowledgement mattered. I realized then that growth doesn't always come from opportunity. Sometimes it comes from interruption, from being stopped long enough to notice what direction you were actually headed in. Those 2 years didn't delay my life. They redirected it. And even now, when I look back, I don't wish I had been cleverer or sneakier or more careful that day. I wish I had been more aware, but awareness is something you earn, not something you start with. I earned mine the hard way. That knowledge didn't make me cautious forever. It made me intentional. I still took risks. I still opened myself to people. But I did it with clarity instead of impulse. I knew what I was choosing and what I wasn't. That sense of authorship over my own life was the real freedom I gained. No one could take it away because it didn't depend on permission anymore. And as I continued moving forward, building relationships and making choices shaped by that understanding, I carried one quiet certainty with me. Even the moments that feel like they trap you can become the ones that teach you how to walk freely if you're willing to learn instead of resist. And I kept learning. There was a stretch of time after all that when nothing dramatic happened, and that, in itself, felt unfamiliar. I had grown used to intensity, to emotions arriving in waves, to moments that forced me to react. Now life felt steadier, almost quiet. At first, I worried that meant I was missing something. Then I realized I wasn't missing anything. I was finally present. I started noticing joy in places I would have ignored before. Long conversations that didn't go anywhere specific. Walking alone without feeling lonely. Even boredom, which I had once feared, became a space where my thoughts could settle instead of spiral. I also noticed how much stronger my sense of self had become. When someone disagreed with me, I didn't immediately doubt myself. When someone misunderstood me, I didn't rush to correct them. I knew who I was, and that knowledge didn't need constant reinforcement. That confidence didn't make me rigid. It made me flexible. I could change my mind without feeling weak. I could admit mistakes without feeling exposed. I could walk away without feeling like I had lost. Those skills weren't obvious to people around me, but they changed everything about how I moved through the world. Sometimes I thought about how easily things could have gone differently. If that door hadn't opened, if my parents hadn't intervened, if I had continued living without interruption. I didn't romanticize those possibilities anymore. I understood now that momentum without reflection can carry you places you're not ready to be. I also understood that my parents had grown through that experience too. They learned when to step back, when to listen, when to trust. Our relationship wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was honest in a way it hadn't been before. We spoke more openly about expectations, about fears, about independence. Not as a battle, but as a negotiation between adults who cared about each other. That shift felt significant. I found myself becoming more intentional with my future as well. I made decisions with a longer view, asking not just, do I want this now, but will I recognize myself after this choice? That question became my filter. It changed who I dated. It changed who I trusted. It changed what I tolerated. I didn't lose my softness. I protected it. There were still moments when temptation whispered, when secrecy seemed easier than honesty, when impulse tried to convince me that consequences were distant. But I had lived the consequences already. Not as fear, but as memory. That memory didn't control me. It guided me. I learned that freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about knowing why you want something and whether that reason aligns with who you are. That understanding didn't make life smaller. It made it deeper. And as I continued forward, step by step, I stopped seeing that difficult chapter as something I had survived. I began to see it as something I had integrated. It lived inside me now, not as a warning, but as wisdom. I didn't know exactly where I was headed yet.
I didn't need to.
I trusted myself to recognize the right direction when it appeared, not because it would feel exciting, but because it would feel honest. And with that trust settled firmly inside me, I kept moving forward, open and grounded, ready for whatever came next, without rushing, without hiding, without losing myself again. What surprised me most, looking back, was how quietly strength can arrive. I had always imagined strength as something loud, defiance, independence, standing your ground dramatically. What I learned instead was that real strength often looks like patience, like waiting, like choosing not to react even when everything inside you wants to. I noticed this especially when people tried to pull me into situations that didn't feel right anymore. Not dangerous situations, just misaligned ones.
Gossip.
Drama. Half-truths. The kind of moments where you're expected to play a role instead of be a person. I didn't announce my withdrawal. I simply didn't step in.
That choice changed how people treated me.
Some stopped calling as often. Some grew more careful with their words around me. A few came closer, sensing that I wasn't interested in performance. Only honesty. I learned then that boundaries don't just protect you, they reveal who is actually meant to stay. There were days when I felt nostalgic for who I had been before everything happened. The girl who acted first and thought later. The girl who believed intensity meant importance. But that nostalgia never lasted long. I could feel the difference now, the steadiness in my chest, the calm in my decisions. I wouldn't trade that for anything. I also became more honest with myself about desire. I stopped pretending that wanting something automatically meant I should have it. Wanting became information, not instruction. That shift alone saved me from repeating old patterns. When attraction appeared, I didn't panic or idealize it. I observed it. I asked myself what it was pointing to. Was it comfort? Curiosity? Validation? Or was it genuine connection? Those questions didn't kill the feeling, they refined it. I think that's when I truly understood what my parents had feared all along. Not the boy, not the moment, but my lack of tools at the time.
Tools to slow down.
To assess. To protect myself without hiding. I had those tools now. One afternoon, while cleaning my room, I found something old, a notebook from that time. Pages filled with confusion, anger, longing. I sat on the floor and read through it slowly. Instead of cringing, I felt compassion. That girl had been trying to make sense of emotions bigger than her experience. I closed the notebook gently and put it away. Not to hide it, to honor it. I didn't need to rewrite my past to respect my growth. Both could exist at the same time. I realized then that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without losing your balance. It means being able to look back without wanting to run forward or backward. That balance changed how I faced challenges later in life. When things felt uncertain, I didn't rush to escape the discomfort. I stayed with it long enough to understand what it was asking of me. Sometimes the answer was action. Sometimes it was restraint. Both were valid. I had learned that life doesn't punish you for slowing down. It often rewards you for it. As I moved further into adulthood, making bigger decisions, forming deeper relationships, I carried this lesson with me quietly. I didn't talk about it often. I didn't need to. It lived in how I moved, how I chose, how I protected my peace. And when people asked me how I became so grounded, I never pointed to success or discipline or rules. I thought of that moment, the door, the silence, the years that followed. I thought of how being stopped taught me how to walk. And that understanding stayed with me, steady and unshaken, as I continued forward, not rushing toward freedom, but carrying it carefully, knowing exactly what it was worth. There was a time after all of that when I realized I had stopped measuring my life against anyone else's timeline. I wasn't late. I wasn't behind. I wasn't missing anything that was meant for me. That realization brought a deep sense of relief. I hadn't known I was carrying tension around. I watched people rush into things, relationships, decisions, versions of themselves they hadn't fully thought through yet. I didn't judge them. I understood the hunger behind that urgency. I had felt it once too, but I no longer felt pulled by it. My pace was my own now. I began to trust the pauses in my life. When nothing happened, I didn't assume something was wrong. I let stillness do its work. That patience sharpened my instincts. I could feel when something was forced and when it was unfolding naturally. The difference became impossible to ignore. I also noticed how much lighter I felt without secrets. Not because I shared everything, but because I wasn't hiding anything essential. There's a clarity that comes when your inner life and outer life stop contradicting each other. You sleep better. You breathe deeper. You stand straighter without even trying. I thought often about younger me during that period of restriction, how desperate she had been for understanding, for someone to say, "You're not bad, you're just learning." I became that voice for myself eventually, and then quietly for others. When friends confided in me about mistakes, about being caught, about feeling controlled or misunderstood, I didn't rush to take sides. I held space. I knew how painful it feels when your intentions are questioned before you fully understand them yourself. I also knew something else by then. Growth doesn't always feel like progress while it's happening. Sometimes it feels like loss, like being held back, like watching life happen from the outside. Only later do you realize it was shaping you for something steadier. My relationship with my parents continued to evolve. We didn't revisit the past often, but when we did, there was no sharpness left. Just shared recognition that we had all been afraid in different ways. That mutual understanding softened everything between us. One afternoon, my mother said quietly, "I see how you carry yourself now." There was pride in her voice, not the loud kind, but the kind that feels earned. I didn't need her approval anymore, but receiving it without tension felt like closure. I had learned to be responsible without becoming rigid, open without being careless, independent without being isolated. Those balances didn't come naturally, they were practiced, refined over time. And slowly, I realized something important. I wasn't living in reaction to my past anymore. I wasn't proving anything. I wasn't compensating. I was simply living. That shift changed how I approached every new chapter. I didn't ask, "Will this make me happy right now?" I asked, "Will this let me stay honest with myself?" That question became my guide. I knew there would still be challenges ahead. Life doesn't stop offering them. But I also knew I would meet them differently now. Not with panic, not with rebellion, but with grounded clarity. And as I moved forward, steady and self-aware, I carried with me the quiet knowledge that the hardest lessons are often the ones that teach you how to live gently, without losing your strength. I kept going. At some point, I stopped thinking of that chapter as something that happened to me and started seeing it as something that happened for me. That shift didn't arrive suddenly. It came in pieces, scattered across ordinary days, in moments so small I almost missed them. Like the day I realized I wasn't afraid of disappointment anymore. Before, disappointment used to feel like failure, like proof that I had chosen wrong or moved too slowly. Now it felt like information, something to learn from, not something to escape. When plans didn't work out, when people didn't meet my expectations, I didn't collapse inward. I adjusted. That ability to adjust quietly became one of my greatest strengths. I also noticed how differently I handled being alone. Loneliness had once felt heavy, almost suffocating. Now solitude felt spacious. I could sit with myself without needing noise or validation to fill the gaps. That didn't mean I didn't value connection. It meant I didn't depend on it to feel whole. This changed the kind of energy I brought into relationships. I wasn't searching anymore. I wasn't trying to be seen or chosen. I was present, and that presence attracted people who were equally grounded. Conversations felt slower, deeper. There was less performance, more sincerity. Less urgency, more curiosity. I remember one interaction in particular, not dramatic, not romantic in any obvious way, that made me pause. Someone asked me what I wanted out of life, and for the first time, I didn't answer with roles or milestones. I didn't talk about age or timelines or expectations. I said, I want to stay honest with myself. The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise them. That honesty extended to my parents as well. I no longer avoided difficult conversations. I approached them calmly, without blame or defensiveness. When I needed space, I said so. When I needed support, I asked. That clarity changed the dynamic between us more than any rule ever could. There was mutual respect now, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. I also became more forgiving of the version of myself that didn't know any better. I stopped wishing she had been wiser or quieter or more careful. She had been brave in her own way, even if that bravery lacked direction. Without her missteps, I wouldn't have learned how to pause, how to listen, how to choose. I carried her with me, not as a regret, but as a reminder. As the years continued, I noticed how often people confuse speed with progress. They rushed to label things, to define outcomes, to secure certainty. I didn't need certainty anymore. I needed alignment. And alignment doesn't rush. There were moments when life tempted me to move faster again, to say yes before I felt ready, to commit before I felt grounded. Each time, I checked in with myself. Not from fear, but from respect. That check-in became automatic, like breathing. I understood now that freedom isn't about removing all boundaries. It's about choosing the right ones. And as I continued forward, building a life shaped by intention rather than impulse, I felt something I had never truly felt before, a deep, steady sense of trust in myself. That trust didn't promise ease. It promised resilience. And with that resilience quietly holding me up, I kept walking, open, aware, and no longer afraid of where my own choices might lead. There was a point when I realized I no longer flinched when the past surfaced. It would appear sometimes without warning, in a passing comment, a familiar tone of concern, a memory triggered by a place or a smell. But instead of tightening inside me, I met it with calm recognition. It no longer asked for resolution. It had already given me what it needed to give. I started trusting that feeling, the absence of urgency. When something didn't move forward immediately, I didn't push it. When an answer didn't come right away, I waited. That patience wasn't passive. It was active awareness, a quiet confidence that what was meant to unfold would do so in its own time. I noticed how differently I handled uncertainty now. Before, uncertainty felt like danger. It made me anxious, restless, desperate to fill the gap with action. Now it felt like space, a place where clarity could arrive if I didn't rush past it. That shift influenced everything. When challenges came up, disagreements, misunderstandings, moments where expectations didn't align. I didn't collapse into silence or explode into defense. I asked questions. I listened. I chose my words carefully, not to control outcomes, but to stay honest with myself. That honesty became my anchor. I also became more selective with my energy. Not withdrawn, intentional. I paid attention to how I felt after spending time with people. Energized or drained. Grounded or scattered. Calm or unsettled. Those signals guided my choices more reliably than logic ever had before. Some connections deepened. Others naturally loosened. I didn't force either. I stopped seeing endings as failures. I saw them as information about timing, alignment, readiness. That perspective softened the fear I used to carry around loss. When something ended, I trusted that it had served its purpose. The relationship with my parents continued to evolve too. There was less instruction now, more conversation. They asked for my perspective. They listened without immediately correcting. That mutual respect felt earned, built slowly over years of consistency rather than one moment of change. Sometimes, I wondered what my life would have looked like if that door had never opened. If that moment had never interrupted my momentum. But I didn't linger there. That question no longer carried weight. It was hypothetical, not haunting. What mattered was who I was now. I was someone who could sit with discomfort without trying to escape it. Someone who could feel attraction without losing herself in it. Someone who could choose honesty even when secrecy felt easier. That self-awareness didn't isolate me. It connected me more deeply to the right people. Conversations felt more real. Silences felt less awkward. I didn't feel the need to perform or impress. I showed up as I was, trusting that was enough. I also noticed how much more compassionate I had become, not just toward others, but toward myself. When I made mistakes, I corrected course without punishment. When I felt unsure, I didn't shame myself for it. I treated uncertainty as part of the process, not a flaw. That gentleness was new. And as life continued to move forward, offering new situations, new connections, new choices, I carried that gentleness with me. It shaped how I loved, how I decided, how I spoke. I didn't rush into the future anymore. I met it step by step. And with each step, I felt more at home in my own life, grounded, present, and quietly confident in my ability to navigate whatever came next. There comes a moment when you realize you're no longer becoming someone. You are someone. Not fixed, not finished, but rooted. That's how this story truly ends for me. Not with rebellion, not with regret, not even with resolution in the way people expect. It ends with understanding. I understand now that being caught didn't ruin my life. It interrupted it long enough for me to learn how to live it with intention. I understand that my parents weren't trying to cage me. They were trying to protect something they saw I didn't yet know how to protect myself. And I understand myself in a way I never could have without that pause. I don't carry resentment anymore. I don't carry shame. I carry awareness. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but shows up every time I make a choice that feels aligned instead of rushed. I learned that love doesn't need secrecy to feel real. That freedom doesn't need rebellion to feel earned. That growth often arrives quietly, disguised as limitation. If that door had never opened, I might have kept running, chasing feelings without understanding them, mistaking intensity for meaning. Instead, life stopped me, held me still, and asked me to look inward. I did. And when I started moving again, I moved differently. More gently. More honestly. More fully myself. That's what stayed with me. That's what shaped everything that came after. And if this story felt familiar, if it reminded you of a moment when life forced you to slow down, reflect, and grow, then you already understand what I learned. Some lessons hurt when they arrive, but they protect you for a lifetime. Subscribe this channel for more.